Please can we welcome Jason Semmens to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that running? I finally succumbed and put my jacket on. It's just a little bit too cold. Right, I was remarking to Brian when I came in earlier on, most of the talks today are sort of fairly archaeologically focused in perhaps one or two broader senses, but I'm going to approach this from a slightly different direction, a slightly more literary direction, as it were. And I think one of the reasons Brian invited me along was to talk a little bit more about the early 20th century evidence for apotropaic, well, not so much marks, but certainly practices, and in particular in Cornwall, which is my particular area of study. I've been looking fairly intensively at the materials for about the past 25 years or so. And if any of you have been particularly interested in Cornish folklore over the years, you'll know that, a very elongated photograph, you'll know that Robert Hunt, who is this fellow, is the first of the Cornish folklorists to get published. And actually, he's one of the first in the country to get published. He published 2 volumes in 1865 on Cornish folklore, and then he was followed by non-elongated William Bottrell in 1870, who then published 3 volumes over the course of those 10 years between 1870 and 1880. And Hunt and Bottrell's collections have, in a sense, sort of codified Cornish folklore, although we need to kind of understand them a little bit more as ideas of storytelling rather than all history, it seems to me. And it's also worth pointing out that they were written at a time when Cornwall was, in effect, sort of reaching the peak of its industrial sort of prowess, if you like, in the mid-1860s. And then by the time Bottrell was writing in the 1870s, the copper and then tin industries were effectively collapsing at that point. Cornwall's population contracted by about a third in that decade. So the Cornish psyche, if you like, was explored by Bottrell in particular in his writings. Now, in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the idea of the Celtic League took hold, and Cornwall wasn't invited to join it to start with because it didn't have its own language, in fact. So in the early part of the 19th century, the Cornish scholars, particularly Henry Jenner and Robert Morton Nance, set about creating, or rather recreating, Cornish as a viable spoken language. It had pretty much fizzled out by the end of the 18th century. And in 1920, you then get the start of the Old Cornwall movement, which was pretty much set up by Robert Morton Nance. So the folklore collectors, or the successors of the 19th century ones, particularly Robert Hunt and William Bottrell, were working rather more within this context of Old Cornwall, whose motto was, "Gather ye the fragments that remain, lest nothing be lost." This is a quote from the Gospel of St. John. Really what they were doing were looking for the indicators or the cultural markers of the Celticity of Cornwall, and that was expressed through its language and through its culture in particular, and also by its folklore. So what happened was that numerous members of the Old Cornwall Society went out across Cornwall and started collecting bits and pieces of folklore that they could find, and they were understanding it very much in terms of survivals, which was nothing particularly unusual, of course, in the early 20th century to understand folklore in that sense, but they were going around looking for these fragments, if you like. So they weren't looking for a sort of coherent system of or religion, but they were looking for these sort of detritus, in a sense, that had survived through the 19th century through into the early 20th. Now, there were a number of individuals in the early 20th century who were interested in folklore and went collecting. By far the most significant in terms of witchcraft was this fellow, who is called William Henry Painter. He was born in 1901 in Callington, which today I suppose is most famous for Ginster's pasties. But in those days it was, or rather a little before he was born, was particularly noted as a mining centre along the Tamar Valley. When he was born, the mining industry was effectively finished. But nevertheless, it was Callington, that area was very much an agricultural area. And he seems to have been inspired into collecting witch stories by his grandfather. He used to tell him these tales after dark, after he pulled up and done his homework, and apparently he was so afraid of tales of witches and ghosts that he had to be escorted home because he was too afraid to go in the dark himself. However, he had a story about the so-called White Witch of Plymouth, and in about 1926 or 27, he was attending a meeting of the Old Cornwall Federation, and Henry Jenner and Robert Morton Nance overheard him telling this story at the back of the hall, and then invited him to come up to the front and tell it. And then he was encouraged by them to go out and collect these stories. So he's a pretty fundamental figure for anyone interested in witchcraft in Cornwall, certainly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And what he did, by 1930, he tells us that he travelled around to every parish in Cornwall and had been collecting stories and memorates, which are first-person narratives with a sort of a supernatural theme. He'd been collecting these stories and had been pretty much all over Cornwall by 1930. He really struck gold with this guy who's called James Thomas, or Jim Thomas, who lived in Camborne in West Cornwall. And he seems to have been a sort of font, if you like, of old Cornish stories. And he knew a number of witch stories himself. He went out and asked a number of old people that he knew as well for witch stories. And there are 5 letters in a letter collection written by him that he sent to Painter. Painter used these as the basis of a number of articles that were published. Painter wrote quite voluminously, but he mostly wrote as a journalist. He got published in a range of newspapers in the West Country, in Cornwall in particular. So in fact you have to trawl through old newspapers really to find his articles. I've compiled a bibliography which runs to about 8 pages. His archive, unfortunately, his family destroyed most of it after he died, but there's still about 7 boxes or so of his papers remaining, and I've spent quite some time researching through them. And for his efforts, he was made a Bard of the Cornish Gorseth, which first started in 1928. He was barded in 1930. This is a much older, or rather much later picture, I should say, probably taken around 1960. But you can see them there in their pale blue bardic robes. He also, as well as witch stories, collected stories about ghosts. And this is rather a fun caricature that somebody did. There's a rather funny tale he tells of going ghost hunting in an old manor house, and he and a companion decided to stake this out, and by midnight they were thoroughly bored because nothing was happening, and then suddenly they heard this low moan that seemed to echo around this hall. So they went exploring and located it behind a door, and just when they thought they had found something, they burst open the door and found a Great Dane, which was just as bored as they were, and it was the one that was moaning. However, the reason, or one of the reasons why Painter is also very significant is that as well as these stories and narratives he was collecting, he also collected objects. He was also interested in the material culture of witchcraft and unbewitching. This is a photograph, I guess, taken in the 1960s, and you can see him here now with his collection of objects that he collected. Because of what he was doing, because of his publishing, other people were interested in him, really from the late 1920s onwards. We've got descriptions of people going to his house in Callington, and they describe, and this is as late as the sort of 1928, 1930 period, or as early as that, I should say. So he was clearly collecting objects at the same time as he was collecting these narratives as well, and folk stories. And you can't see too well what's going on in this picture, but if I move on to the next one, you'll all recognise this, of course. This was apparently collected from an older woman, and, well, you all know what it's for, repelling witchcraft, from the 3 books of occult philosophy of Agrippa, particularly. But this is a particularly nice piece on vellum, which still survives in a private collection. We also have, or he collected these items as well, and you can see the abracadabra charm up on the, is that point? No, it doesn't. What is that one? No, yes it does. So there's that one. This one is a charm for snake bite. This item is what's called a kenning stone, and this is a small stone that if you had eye complaints, you would rub your eye several times with it, and that would help reduce it. This item here, this bag contained bats' wings and apparently was held up, or rather suspended, near the door of the home, and apparently it would reduce or repel all terrors by night. And Painter was able to collect this from an elderly lady. We have double hazelnuts here, which apparently were an infallible cure for toothache. And you have this small coffin-shaped box, which apparently, Painter doesn't describe what went in it, but apparently there were some kinds of charms inside it. And finally we have this mommet here, which although you can't really see it, it has some pins or nails staked into its heart and also into the right leg as well. Other items that he was able to collect are witch bottles. So this one came from a place called Killygarth Manor House just outside of Looe and seems to have been recovered sometime in the 1960s. It's just a green glass wine bottle, but it's been stoppered, and although the glass seems to have decayed somewhat, or the interior contents have decayed, but nevertheless there's stuff in it for sure. And this second one here, the coat of arms on it relates to the Edgecombe family of East Cornwall, and this similarly was found in East Cornwall as well, within a particular context. Painter, certainly in his published notes, rarely describes actually where any of these things really came from. So provenance and context, somewhat difficult to know precisely where he got quite a number of these items from. He sort of just describes an old woman he got these things from, or an old man. But certainly the Killygarth one is quite interesting. And this item, which is a kind of, I assume, violin-shaped bottle, contains hundreds and thousands, and the idea was that that would be hung up inside your front door, and if a witch then wanted to come in to get at you, well, she'd have to sit there and count these hundreds and thousands before she could actually do anything, and the idea being that this would take her all night, and in consequence then she would sort of give up out of boredom. So he collected quite a wide range of different items during his lifetime, and he also collected various, charms, textual amulets at the same time as well. We've seen that abracadabra one. This one, again, does anyone recognise? This is from the Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott. And as you can see, whoso beareth this sign about him, let him fear no foe but fear God. And again, this sigil up here, again, that circular design, obviously is the main sort of protective device. And this one says it's found near Helston. So he collected all of this material, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s, which was when he was most active as a folklore researcher. But what's rather interesting for the public reception of this is it wasn't just his journalistic writings that he produced. He actually set up his own museum, that sort of World War II pre- and post-war period of individuals creating their own museums. Seems to be, well, not common, but it was certainly something that happened. And in 1959, he set up the Cornish Museum in East Looe, just behind the quayside in the harbour there, in an old fish cellar. So what you have here is a photograph looking along towards the rear, and the front door is sort of behind where I'm stood. What you can see, obviously, the various cases and items on the sides. His witchcraft collection was in this area, his Cornish witchcraft collection. So the museum became very much Painter's sort of, if you like, sort of way that he was presenting this material to the public during the period when it was open in the 1960s and 70s. And he was known to give tours of the collection, and apparently he was quite a significant sort of raconteur as well. So this would have been part of the way that people would have understood and sort of interacted, as it were, with this kind of material culture of witchcraft at this time. And here is Painter stood outside the Cornish Museum holding, it looks like a lump of coal, but it's the so-called Caradon meteorite. The other aspect that I think personally that Painter's quite interesting and significant is the idea then of the decline of magic through the 20th century, which of course Owen Davies has written about extensively, Ronald Hutton, Carl Bell, because really through Painter's writings and through this material collection that he's been able to put together, what he's doing really in effect is actually allowing us to sort of look back and see that decline through Cornwall and the West Country slightly more widely. So what you tend to find in his writings is that in the earlier 1920s and 30s, he's able to describe charmers, he's able to describe cunning folk at that particular time. He would describe them as being grey witches or white witches, black witches, again, sort of fairly common nomenclature for folklorists at that particular time. But what's rather interesting as you move on, he doesn't really talk about cunning folk anymore. And certainly in the post-war period of the 1950s and into the 60s, he only really then refers to charmers. And he says he knows a number of charmers. What's interesting as well is that a range of people through his media appearances wrote to him. They wrote to him as the Cornish charmer or the Cornish witchfinder, which was his nickname. And some of these letters survive. You can go through them and somewhat statistically kind of look at what people were interested in having undone. So you do find, wart charming and things like this that people want, but you also find people who've lost their husbands or their wives, interested in attracting a particular boyfriend or girlfriend. Occasionally they've sort of lost things. So you can sort of look through really, and because there's a collection from the early 1930s and again from the 60s, you can kind of see actually how things like the sort of good luck part of it, or even sort of unbewitching that's there in the 1930s has effectively vanished by the 1960s. By that point, again, it's mainly focusing on wart charming, that kind of thing. So I've been doing quite a bit of work on him, particularly recently, and as my time is almost up, I'm just going to kind of give a bit of a shameless plug because hopefully in the new year a little book about him will be appearing that will be drawing together his most significant writings. He actually wrote a book about Cornish witchcraft that he never got published in his lifetime, and then the manuscript of which disappeared after he died, and no one knew where it was. And then in 2009 it appeared, and not just in one version, but two. It transpires he wrote this book by the end of the 1930s, sent it off to a London literary agent who said it's great, but really you need to edit it a bit more. It's a bit too long. So he did that, and both versions of this manuscript are in existence. So that will be featuring in this book that will be coming out next year. So I think my time is more or less up, and that's the end of my slides. So any questions, I guess, is the question.